My name is Jerry Gordon. I'm a senior editor at the New English Review, and we are here with Dr. Stephen Bryen, a noted international technological and security expert. And we have had Stephen on before several times, but there are a number of things going on in this world that basically prompted us to hold a discussion today. Steve, I'd like to start off about a subject that you and I have talked about previously, about how to deal with cheap drones, whether they're state or non-state sponsored. But tell us about this almost comical but serious incident that involved the downing of a Hezbollah drone by Israel to start with.
Well, the Israelis haven't told us how they got it, what they did to it. There's a picture of it you can see on the news stories. It looks intact to me. Looks like it just came down, which means it probably was jammed electronically. It wasn't shot down. Yeah. There's a couple of ways you can get them without breaking them up. I mean, one is just that way, jam them. The other is to catch them in a net, believe it or not. And the net can be dropped from a helicopter or it can be fired from the ground, and it wraps around the thing and grabs it. I don't think it was a net because there's no sign of one. And usually the props, the little propellers, which is a quadcopter, had 4 propellers, would be broken, or at least some of them would be. So I think this was jammed. I think that's how they got it. It's a cheap Chinese quadcopter. They're commercially around. There's thousands. In fact, there's millions of them. When I say cheap, I mean $200 maybe. I mean, very low price. And it was sent over to spy. Interesting thing is that it had a memory chip in it, and the memory chip had all the video that the thing was making, and the Israelis got it. So they know what was being spied on. It's kind of amusing. But they also, when they were getting this thing ready, the memory thing was on. So the camera inside the drone was taking pictures of the guys operating. so they have their faces, not that it's worth much, but
right.
But they could see the kind of controller, which is a typical, in the picture, you can see the guy holding a little controller, which is a typical drone controller that you buy, in a hobby shop. So there's nothing special about it. It's just it had a camera and it had a memory card in it. And there it was. That's one kind of cheap drone. That's a cheap drone, which is, some larger quadcopters, which are also commercial, can be retrofitted with an explosive, for example, a grenade shell or something, and sent over, try to kill people with it. And that's been done. We've seen that coming out of Gaza, and we've seen that coming out of Syria, aimed at the Russians, and we've seen it in Iraq. So we've seen it. It's there.
So what are the options for effective countermeasures? You just mentioned jamming, but jamming also has its side effects. So what else is out there?
Well, jamming's pretty good. I mean, most of these drones operate about 2.4 gigahertz, which is the same band that your cell phone operates. So that that's fairly common. Some of them actually even work on Wi-Fi. But jamming those things or jamming the GPS are options that are pretty good ones. They're called non-kinetic. You're not blowing it up, you're just jamming it. And that comes in different flavors. There's jamming and control, where you can jam it or actually take over the control of the quadcopter or whatever kind of drone it is, and actually manage it, which is not a bad idea if you can do it. Or you can just simply make it stupid, so it loses command and control and it falls out of the sky. So making it stupid. The only problem with making it stupid is that if you do it over your own territory, and particularly over your own base, if you're trying to defend an air base or an army base or something like that, is it can fall on your head, and if it has an explosive, it can still do damage. So there's a downside to just jamming, and you have to keep that in mind. By the way, it also applies even to when you shoot it down. If you don't completely kill it, it might still explode and cause damage.
So we had some drones that apparently were originated out of Iran that were used against US forces in bases in Syria.
That's right. Also in Iraq too.
Right, in
Yeah.
Iraq.
Yeah. Those are a little bit
and-
bigger drones, and they're suicide drones, kamikaze drones, as some people call them. Not loitering munitions exactly, because they don't hover over a site. They just send them direct to the target. Yeah, and they can have a pretty good explosive package hung on them. They're usually the drone itself is usually made in Iran, most of them, or at least the parts are made in Iran, except for the engines and the electronics, which are made in China.
Mhm.
And they usually either single cylinder or a two-cylinder engine, Chinese engine. They cost anywhere from $400 to $1,000. These engines, so they're still pretty cheap from a weapons point of view. Electronics are dirt cheap, and they put a camera in them, and they put an explosive package in them, and off they go.
So the US has this device, I think it's called a CRAM, that was positioned at the Al Saad Air Base. And
That's right. I have one at the US Embassy in Baghdad as well.
But that almost looks like a blunderbuss, so to speak, against these cheap Iranian drones.
Well, it's a kind of classical, old-fashioned, updated, old-fashioned solution. It's a rapidly firing 6-barrel Gatling gun that shoots 20 millimeter shells, which have timers in them, so that they don't, if they don't hit something, they will explode in the air and not on top of some poor civilian. And it's based on the Navy CWIS Phalanx rapid fire gun, which is the last resort gun on ships. It's very popular. It has never actually succeeded in shooting anything down, but that doesn't stop people from buying it. Now the CRAM's done better. I mean, the CRAM itself has, the C being the letter C, not the ocean, has done better. I mean, it's shot down some small Katyusha rockets, and it's shot down some drones. So it's done better. But it's a kind of, I don't know, bonsai approach. You just pepper the air with these shells and hope you nail it. It shoots, I forget how many, 4,000 rounds a minute or something, something like that. Although its magazine, it holds far less. So you pretty rapidly don't have any more ammunition because you're shooting at such a rapid pace. But it works to a certain degree, particularly if it's one drone or two drones. But then if you get a lot more, it's overwhelmed. It can't handle multiple targets very effectively because it has to concentrate on one until it hits it. So in the meantime, the others are coming in. So you got that problem.
So that means in the age of artificial intelligence and drone swarms that something like a CRAM system is not going to be terribly effective, is it?
Well, it's very short range.
Yeah.
Yeah, but of course, so is the detection capabilities. I mean, these drones, you don't really pick them up until they're practically on top of you. So you're shooting on, it's like sitting on your roof of your house and shooting straight up. Maybe you'll hit it, maybe you won't, but even if you do, it's going to fall on your house. So, it's not the best of solutions, but it's what the Army has right now. That, and of course, they also have some missiles that they can use, but it's awfully expensive to fire a $50,000 missile at a $20 drone. It's not cost effective. And that's why everyone's looking for other kinds of solutions. Lasers is one of them, jamming, of course, is one of them. Nets and stuff like that. Even
Israeli,
guns,
Israeli,
single shot guns that can actually identify the drone and nail it, but still short range. In fact, even some talk about using hawks and other birds that can go and, I don't know if they're going to peck at the drone or what they're going to do, but grab a drone, with their talons and fly off. But it's not the best solution. I think that probably high-powered microwave and lasers are most promising.
speaking about that, the Israelis have developed something called the Iron Beam. Almost sounds like a cousin of Iron Dome.
Yeah, it is. It's a short range.
Is that supposed to be a high energy laser?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And that's designed a similar way to kind of fry the drone.
Okay.
Yeah. You get it's EMP, it's electric magnetic pulse. I mean, basically, that's not only crapping up the electronics of the drone, but it may knock off the explosive and set it off in the air, which is good. I mean, I think it's good. It's not yet proven that it's efficient.
Correct.
Certainly cheap because you're basically using electricity.
Yeah.
But it's how efficient it is something that I think needs to be demonstrated still.
Okay.
The most efficient is jamming and cheapest. And the more sophisticated the jammers can be, there's all kinds. There's handheld ones, little ones, and there's big guys you put on top of a truck, that have big antennas and can reach out further and do more. So they come in all flavors, but I think the more powerful ones, the Russians have been focusing on that, and they claim that their system that they put around the Khmeimim base in Syria has been effective in stopping even swarming drones. So if they're telling the truth, they don't always, but if they're telling the truth and they're right, then that is a technology that is straightforward. It's well known. There's no special magic in it, no special technology beyond what's known. So something should be pursued. The U.S. I think, has some kind of disease. I don't know what else you call it, the Army especially, in resisting trying to use these kinds of techniques. I mean, look at the Al-Assad base in Iraq that was just hit 3 times, 3 days in a row. And they didn't have jammers, or at least there's none that was visible. They didn't have lasers. They didn't have anything other than a missile.
Mhm.
They used and the CRAM gun, which they used. So they could have done better, I think, but they didn't.
Speaking about the missile that may have been used in this last activity, that was what, a Stinger?
That was a Stinger, probably on an Avenger chassis that was at the base, and that's a guess, but because the Pentagon has refused to tell us that it was a Stinger or that it was an Avenger, or they just simply didn't tell us, which is okay. I mean, I think they're entitled not to give away all their cards in their deck to the enemy, because once you tell, the enemy knows. Not that it would matter, because there's not much the enemy can do about it.
Right.
But again, it's the Avenger. In fact, the Avenger system was retired in the 90s because it's based on it sits on a Humvee body, and the general assessment was that it would be easy for the enemy to attack the Avenger and destroy it, because it was not hardened in any way. It wasn't armored, and it wasn't exactly a very pleasant place for a gunner to be sitting, because he sits right inside.
Right.
Not a lot of guys are going to volunteer for that duty. I mean, thank you. I got something else to do this weekend. Maybe get Joe to do it. So they retired them, almost all of them. They kept 5 or 6 in the Army, similar number in the National Guard for practice. But I think starting in 2019, they realized they didn't have anything. and they were worried about drone threats, not only in the Middle East, but particularly in Europe,
Yep.
coming from the Russians, who are getting more and more drone savvy. So they pulled them out of storage, they updated them a little bit and sent them into the field. And one has been spotted, at least one has been spotted in Iraq. So I think they put them back in service. And they have a newer version, which is on an armored chassis, a Bradley fighting vehicle chassis, which should be more survivable, let's call it that, if attacked. But it's still it's a very uneven technology because it's expensive. If one of those missiles costs, I think, $50,000, something like that. A lot of money.
Well, the Iron Dome.
Iron Dome's expensive too, but they don't want to
Yep.
use it against drones
No.
because they know it's too expensive. It's bad enough to have to use it against these Qasem rockets, cheap junk themselves.
Right.
They have to protect people, but it's a very expensive exercise. So moving toward other solutions like jammers and lasers is probably sensible if they can be continually improved and made effective.
That also
that
requires,
to be seen.
Yeah, but it also requires significant power for the lasers in particular.
Yeah, you have to have generators. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep,
Moving right along, we had Kim Il-sung, or whatever his name is these days, in North Korea announcing a test.
Kim Jong-un.
Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. I got confused. It's Kim is the last name, but in Asia they put the last name first and then the surname after that. Jong-un.
So they announced the test of an alleged hypersonic missile.
Yeah. Right.
How realistic is that for North Korea versus China, Russia, and the US at this point?
Well, the South Koreans tracked it.
Yep.
And they say it's not a hypersonic missile, it's just a missile.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't maneuver because they were claiming it was able to maneuver.
Right.
And it didn't happen. There was no maneuvering. It's just a missile test. They overhyped it. I don't think that, look, hypersonics is a very difficult technology. If you want to have a glide vehicle that can maneuver. Now, you can have it without a glide vehicle, like the Russian Kinzhal really can't maneuver much, but it goes awfully fast. But there's no sign that was the case in this North Korean test. Plus, for hypersonics, you need materials that can withstand heat, because these are going awfully fast in the atmosphere and they're generating a vast amount of heat on their surface, which will deform them and unless the materials are right. And I don't think there's any possibility that the North Koreans have that kind of material.
On the other hand, we've talked previously about China and its version of the hypersonic as a possible threat here.
I think the Chinese are a different story. Look, Chinese scientists were invited by NASA to participate in their ceramics and other materials programs in the 1990s. And so they got all the knowledge they needed to get, if they didn't have it already, on how to build, materials that can resist reentry and that can survive under hypersonic speed conditions. And no one ever said anything about it. This is part of this awful story about the United States freely giving away its know-how and technology to potential adversaries. And it's still going on, and we're idiots in this country, complete idiots. But we're doing it, and then it seems that the leadership in Washington is simply incapable of dealing with this kind of problem, and they've failed to do it, and so they've given it all away. I've been saying for years we have two defense budgets, one for us and one for them, because basically we're financing their R&D and their science, and of them they're very grateful. And what they can't get directly, through the generosity of the Defense Department or other agencies like NASA, they get by stealing it with cyber attacks and things like that, spying.
Well, we had the recent sentencing of a Harvard University professor, Charles Lieber, as I recall.
Lieber, yeah. Well, he hasn't been
was-
sentenced yet. He's been convicted.
He's been convicted, but
That's
he's
nanotechnology.
yes, for nanotechnology, which is a pretty significant sector.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bill Gertz had a very good piece the other day. Bill Gertz is a very good journalist and specialist in defense stuff. On how the Chinese are trying to use nanotechnology for mind control of their own soldiers, to make them more fearless and also to integrate them better with machines in real time. And that's what this is all about from a military point of view. It has civilian uses, which are quite promising in terms of being able to deal with various kinds of cerebral damage, or spinal damage, where people can't function correctly, but with the use of nanomesh technology, interfaces can be made between machines and the person so they can think certain things which can then appear legible and understandable to people outside. It's very interesting. They actually did this a few weeks ago in the United States, where tested. A guy could send tweets, even though he couldn't talk or type or do anything like that, but he could think the tweets, and they would translate through an interface of a computer, and then go out, as a Twitter tweet. It demonstrated that you can do this. I think that was quite exciting. So for people with muscular dystrophy and other diseases that are really problematic in terms of functionality, this is a very promising technology. Having said that, it's also a very dangerous technology. And for that reason, it should have been controlled by the United States, but it wasn't. Not at all. I mean, Lieber got convicted mostly. He got convicted for some IRS stuff too, but mostly about not following the requirements of his contract with the U.S. government that said that he had to report any foreign contacts and get approval to cooperate, especially with China, which he didn't do. In fact, half of his staff at Harvard were Chinese. So, I mean, this was not. I don't know. I mean, I get the feeling that until Lieber, someone decided to go after Lieber, that these things were tolerated all over the place, and nobody paid attention to these contracts or cared one way or another, which is typical of Washington. And kind of blinked, winked and blinked and said, "Oh, yeah, what the hell? A few hundred Chinese scientists aren't going to make any difference."
It's amazing.
Well, it's a sad story, and I'm not sure Lieber should be held up as an example by himself, first of all. And I'm not sure whether the culpability is not just as much on the U.S. government. I mean, I think the U.S. has not performed well here.
What stymies the achievement of an active missile defense system equivalent to what Israel's tri-level umbrella is all about?
Political. It's political in this country. There is a strong opposition to missile defense and to and strong support for what's called the MAD doctrine, mutually assured destruction doctrine. If we have them and they have them, then nobody's going to use them. That's the theory. Now, that was sort of dealt a side-glancing blow on the chin with the arrival of the rogue states capability, like North Korea and Iran, to Pakistan. There's others, India, that could launch missiles, and some of them could even hit friendly targets like Israel or Western Europe or even the United States. I mean, the whole, allegedly, the whole reason for the ground-based interceptor that we have in Alaska and in Washington State is supposed to, in California, is supposed to be to prevent an attack by North Korea. but they can probably launch 2 missiles, not something that's going to cause a lot of grief. But Chinese can launch hundreds.
You focused on the current standoff between Russia and Ukraine,
Yeah.
not only on the geopolitical side, but on the technology side. And you were early on indicating kinds of weaponry that potentially the Ukraine has access to counter essentially conventional attacks there. There were 2 that stood out in mind. One was basically something we've talked about previously, which are the suicide loitering munitions. The other, quite frankly, was the use of certain larger drones that have been used most immediately in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia to pretty good effect.
Right.
And then lastly, it's kind of a Turkish version, but not a very good one, I think, of the tank protection systems that Israel has called the trophy system.
Right. I don't know anything about the trophy, the Turkish version, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. I have no idea.
Right.
But I will say that the Turks have very good electronics, and they have partnerships with European companies who have helped them develop their defense electronics capability, and it's quite advanced. It's not trivial. How that translates into an actual product that they're not only deploying but selling is something we don't know yet, because it has never been tested in the real world and under real world conditions. So I don't know the full answer, but we do know that their drones work. The Bayraktar, I'm not sure the pronunciation is right, was very effective in the Nagorno Karabakh conflict. It was also used in Libya. It may have been used along the Syrian border, and now it's, by the way, in Ethiopia, where it's being used against the Tigre rebels.
Right.
So it works. It works best when it's integrated with surveillance drones that have the capability to point it to targets. That's its best, but it can work independently as well. And it did a pretty good job in all these examples. It's a good weapon. It's not so good about killing armor, because the size of the little, it's called a MAML missile that it launches. These are quite small, and so they're, unless you get a really good lucky hit, they're not going to get an armored tank, let's say, but they'll knock out a truck, they'll knock out a command post, they'll do a lot of damage. And there's plenty of video that the Azerbaijanis made of these things striking targets. So there's no secret about it. It was quite devastating. I don't think that now the Russians have jammers and they have ways of trying to block such things. Whether they have them in eastern Ukraine or not, I don't know, but I would guess so. There is a case where at least one Bayraktar knocked out a howitzer a few weeks ago in eastern Ukraine. So it definitely works, and it destroyed a gun.
We've talked in the past about the Israeli loitering munitions.
Yes, they have a number of different kinds. The most advanced and sophisticated is called Harop.
Right.
And the Harop is a stealthy loitering munition, which means that it's hard to see with radar, and therefore it can orbit around a target and wait for things to develop before it launches.
The U.S. does not have something that sophisticated, or not?
Oh, we certainly have. Well, I don't know if we have anything that's quite like that, but we have stuff that does similar job. Yeah.
So could the Ukrainians get access to the Israeli versions of that or not?
Well, the Israelis have been walking on eggs when
I
it comes
know.
to the Ukraine for lots of reasons. I mean, first of all, they need to keep their relationship not only with the Ukrainians, but with the Russians,
Right.
which is a very high security importance because of Syria and Iraq and others, and for that matter, Iran. So they're being very careful. And I don't think they've supplied anything like that to the Ukrainians.
Before we began this discussion, we were talking about what the cost is going to be like to Mr. Putin of maintaining this massive force on the border.
In the winter.
In the winters, right?
It's not cheap.
It's not cheap at all.
It takes lots of fuel, lots of logistics. These are troops that are active anyway. So, I mean, they've just been moved around Ukraine on three sides, according to the New York Times.
Right.
And probably also coming from Belarus. So, yeah, I mean, it's not a free lunch. It's expensive. The Russians don't seem to have problem with that so far. At least they're not saying they do. But who knows? I mean, he put himself in a bit of a bad spot. I mean, by putting those, I mean, I think the idea was to pressure the Ukrainians into negotiating a deal that would cover not only Eastern Ukraine, but we get them to recognize Crimea, which the Ukrainians are never going to do. So it was kind of ambitious beyond expectations, reasonable expectations. And now he's got himself in a trap. I mean, in a way, the Ukrainians aren't doing anything. They're just sitting on their hands. The U.S. is not encouraging them very much to make a deal of any kind. And the U.S. hasn't proposed any counter deal. In fact, the U.S. is pushing harder and harder to get them in NATO, although a lot of European countries are very nervous about that. I mean, they're not going to say it out loud, but they're very nervous about it because, the Ukrainians can get them in a war. They don't want to be in a war. I mean, put it in the simplest terms, because the likelihood is the only way that if NATO came to their support would be to use NATO bases in places like Poland, and that's not a healthy place to be these days. So I think that it's caused a lot of consternation.
So as we are talking, there's a discussion, shall we say, between Russian representatives. One is a diplomat, one is a military deputy minister of defense, and a member of the Biden administration who we saw previously involved with the Iranian negotiation, Wendy Sherman.
Yes.
And we don't know what is going to come out of that at this juncture, except the Russians have made it abundantly clear that they want some action against further, quote, NATO encroachment.
Yeah, which is really, I mean, I think the Russians have put themselves again in a bad position.
Right.
Because you can't guarantee that to them. And you shouldn't, by the way. That doesn't mean you need to put them in NATO, but it's not something you do, not even secretly. It's because there are no secrets anymore these days. No, I mean, the Russians should have gone in and said, look, the Ukrainians have to negotiate with us. We need to sit down. We need, this is what we can accept, more or less, and this is what they have to meet us somewhere in the middle, and get the U.S. to help that process. But it seems like the whole thing's focused on NATO. It's not focused on a deal on the Ukraine, which is kind of crazy.
Except the wiser course of action would be to cut a deal in Ukraine and put aside for the moment the whole question of NATO.
Well, it becomes less urgent if there's not a problem.
Correct.
So, look, NATO, the NATO ministers have been, especially the what's his name, the chairman of NATO, have been very vociferous about bringing Ukraine in. and they seem to be fixated on that. But the truth is that, the NATO is fairly weak. In real terms, if there's a war, it's going to be the United States.
And right now, this administration has communicated that the furthest they might go is to issue a new set of sanctions, shall we say?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of threats and counter threats, going around.
Yeah.
I mean, that's to be expected. The Russians have signaled that they're very pessimistic about these negotiations and don't think anything's going to come out of it. Let's say nothing comes out of it. Then what? You have these troops sitting there. You have the Ukrainians sitting there, got this sort of stalemate, which has been in agony for how long? Since 2014 or something?
Yes.
So it's a long time already. And they're nowhere near finding a solution. Meanwhile, the Russians will step up their efforts to subvert the Ukrainian government through other ways, through other means, and provocations and other things that they can very well do. Look at Kazakhstan. I mean, that seems to be in the same category.
Yeah, it is in the same category. It's glad you brought that up because that was going to be the next item of discussion. I think for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, Kazakhstan is an interesting example of what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s. It became a quasi-prosperous but autocratic country in the middle of nowhere with a huge border. So what is it, 7,000 miles?
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah.
Russia in the north. It's got China to a certain degree, and yet it's loaded with what? Oil, gas, and uranium.
That's right. It's a rich, mineral-rich country.
Exactly.
But also, this is a place where the Russians launch space shots. So,
correct.
So it has importance to Russia from that point of view. I don't know. Nazarbayev, is that his name? Was the former leader, was basically your basic dictator. Not so bad, not so good. Murders a reasonable number of people, but not too many. That sort of operator. What you expect to find in that part of the world. But something happened. And now they're saying a little more honestly that there wasn't a coup attempt and that this whole business was a put-up job by the former head of intelligence or somebody. I'm wondering if it's not even more convoluted and that maybe the Russians were operating the coup. And when the coup started to collapse, they sent in troops and said, we'll stabilize things, we'll fix it. Kind of Dostoevsky style.
And what's the prospect that those paratroopers who were sent in are going to be permanently positioned there?
I'm not sure yet, but it's a good chance they will be.
Yeah. That's what I perceive as well.
Although, you never know about these things because they may just train up the Kazakh military, clean out the bad guys, and then go home. It could possibly. They can come anytime they want. Just get on transports. Come in.
Kazakhstan has pretty good relations with the U.S., I gather, at this point.
It did for a long time, yes.
And that was also true with Israel, as I understand.
Yes. Well, and there's a Jewish population there. If you're interested in those,
that's correct.
We're keeping their heads down.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Well,
but I think it's something. We don't have enough information to know. LNG was one of the price of LNG was an issue because they use propane to run their cars. It's rather than gasoline because that's cheaper. And they raised the price and because they essentially took off the subsidy. And that's when people went in the streets because they couldn't drive their cars or their trucks or whatever. But but was it a coup? If so, what was going on exactly? Who was behind it? They're talking about foreign mercenaries. Who the hell are they? If they turn up any, they may have a Russian accent.
Yes.
So they may not turn up any. I think this is one of those double entendre things. It's there's more than meets the eye here. We have to wait and see. We may never know, but we may figure it out after a while.
Now, of course, right next door to Kazakhstan, as we said, on one of its borders is China.
Yes.
China's one road, one belt, humongous infrastructure projects spread all across Central Asia, Persian Gulf now. Israel has used Chinese firms to handle some stuff in the ports, some other developments. The Horn of Africa, all the way across between the Red Sea and what I call the Gulf of Guinea. So the question here is, how can the US and its alliance partners deal with this monster?
Don't give any money to these countries so that they can't pay their bills, and so that the Chinese find out that they're not going to get paid. Many of them are already saying, let's renegotiate our loans. We can't pay it right now. I mean, this could be a big white elephant, because a lot of these are, if you were a banker and you went to Guinea or someplace like that, and you looked at their finances, I'm not lending you any money. You're in debt. How am I ever going to get paid? Well, the Chinese have stuck their nose way out on very high risk clients. And the high risk clients are saying, what do you mean you're going to take over our port if we don't pay you? You are like hell. I mean, this is going to be a mess. And I think that the Belt and Road may turn out to be Borschten Road before it's over. It's not a very good project. I mean, it's ambitious, yes, but it also is a very very risky from a financial point of view. I'm not talking about any other way, but it's also risky politically, because these countries are going to say, hey, wait a minute, these Chinese are screwing us, let's screw them. I mean, it's going to be, the Chinese are going to find it very unpleasant. Very unpleasant. And Xi could lose his job over it, because they're going to be exposed for trillions of dollars before it's over. And they're not going to have income.
Well, I think that's reflected in the inability, so to speak, that Xi has to deal with projects like this real estate deal for Evergrande. In the United States, you have at least resort to the bankruptcy system. Bankruptcy court. Right.
They don't have that.
They have nothing with that.
The bankruptcy system is they shoot the president of the company.
Yes. So you're right. I mean, one of the lurking dangers for Xi, as much as you'd like to be president for life, is the fact that if he really screws up royally, I'm sure the Comintern will say, time for a change.
It will unleash competition inside China, for sure, because somebody has to take the rap for it, right? I mean, you can shoot all the lower level official you want.
Right.
When your name is written on Belt and Road, Xi, made this in Tanzania, wherever it is, an African state or Asian state or whatever it is, he's holding the bag. And, at some point they're going to say, you got to go.
Right.
But it also raises a question about the Chinese economy, because that debt has to be underwritten somehow. And the usual way that happens is inflation in most normal countries. I don't know how they deal with inflation in China, because they rig the currency. But it'll show up anyway, because people will go to the store and find out that they can't buy the television because it ain't there anymore. It's disappeared because they can't buy the raw materials to make the television. It goes down the supply chain, and pretty soon you end up with paralysis and economic collapse. And that's bad. I mean, for China, it's bad for the world, actually. Yeah. Because an unstable China is not a good thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's where we're heading. It's not moving real fast, but it's moving steadily in that direction. And there's very little chance that most of these clients in the Belt and Road can pay their bills. Very little chance.
Yeah.
And especially with COVID and these other things going on, which is making things even worse because we buy less chocolate from, some African country or less uranium, whatever it is that they're selling to balance their budget, they're not selling, or at least not as much.
Biggest white elephant in that context, before we get on to a significant topic, is the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia that China had clearly invested hundreds of millions of dollars of support for.
Yeah, I better hope the Egyptians don't blow it up.
Oh, exactly.
They don't like it. Messes up the Nile. And
Yep.
So they have, by the way, it's starting to operate.
Yes, it is.
At least that's what they claim.
Well,
I wonder how the Tigre thing is tied into that. That must be, I think. Where's Tigre get its money?
that is an issue.
Well, it's a poor area. The northern part of Ethiopia is quite poor, mountainous, and there's no industry there or anything. So where do they get their money? Where do they get their weapons? Some of them they stole from the Ethiopians, but at some point they have to buy, ammunition and stuff. Where are they getting the money? Somebody's paying them. Now, I hope the United States wasn't, but I wouldn't rule it out. But for sure, the Egyptians had an interest in that, didn't they?
Yes, and to a certain extent, so did Sudan, because there's a
Yeah,
land.
but Sudan is a total disaster.
But as you and I both know, right now, Sudan is in crackers.
Yeah, it's a disaster. I mean, that's a
Complete disaster.
That's worse than a basket case because they kill each other.
Yeah.
But the that dam is a big thorn in the side of the Egyptians because it could wreck their economy. So they have a strong interest. I think they're behind, maybe behind Tigre.
Well, turning.
I don't know for sure, but I mean, there's got to be some explanation, and it's not a simple one because these Tigre guys are also, really Marxists, big time Marxists. So why would, who would support them? Russians. So, but nothing in it for the Russians. Remains to be seen.
You've written, as a matter of fact, recently about China's continuing threat to Taiwan, but also more importantly, some important developments now between Japan and the US on how to deter an invasion. So why don't you cover that?
Well, I think there was what was called a 2+2 meeting on Friday, this past Friday, which would have been the 7th of January.
Yep.
Where the defense minister and prime minister of foreign minister, not prime minister of Japan, and then the Secretary of State of the United States and the chair, it was Lloyd Austin, who's Secretary of Defense, met. They also threw in the new U.S. ambassador to Japan in the conversation. It was a virtual meeting because nobody wanted to catch COVID or get on an airplane for that matter. But you can do that these days. And it was a very promising outcome from the meeting, I'd say, overall, where the sides agreed to really strengthen their capabilities and to confront the Chinese. So I was extremely pleased with the outcome, although it's missing some significant bits that aren't in the communique, but maybe consequent to the communique. I'm hoping so. Where they agreed to strengthen their mutual defense capabilities, not only that, and to coordinate, but also to strengthen the defense of the South, these islands, the Senkaku Islands, particularly the southernmost ones, which are near Taiwan, including Yamaguni, which is the closest one to Taiwan, 67 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
And there had been a previous meeting with Japan's defense self-defense forces and the PACOM, Pacific Command, on the idea of putting the U.S. Marine and the HIMARS system on these islands, probably Unwary, which is the closest one to Taiwan, which would give the Marines a capability of using artillery, rocket artillery, against the Chinese invasion attempt on Taiwan. HIMARS is a good system. So the only thing that wasn't officially decided, explicitly decided, let's put it that way, was setting up a joint command structure.
And you've also addressed that as well, about the importance of having something equivalent to what we have elsewhere. For example, at NATO,
That's right.
joint command structure for
That's
aid.
right.
Why don't you tell our
Oh,
folks?
it's a little tricky because I mean, we need to have one in Asia, right? In East Asia, especially North Asia. But probably anywhere we can have it out there. If we're going to be able to coordinate with our allies and friends in case there's an attack by the Chinese military. Basic idea in NATO is that you can then coordinate all your forces, your logistics, your command and control, your radars. I mean, everything that goes into defending space, and also deconflict the units so they don't kill each other. Yeah, you don't want that to happen. Now, the wrinkle in terms of Japan is that Japan has a constitution, which we put there, MacArthur put there, which limits the role of their self-defense forces to Japanese territory. So theoretically, they are, if Japan launched an airplane, it couldn't fly over Taiwan because it's outside of its space, so to speak. It's limited by its constitution. There was very little chance that the constitution is going to get changed. And I don't know if we need to change it, but I think we need to have a flexible interpretation, let's call it that. And I think that's where we're heading, actually, with these exercises, with the Japanese Navy and Air Force and whatnot are taking part in all sorts of exercises well beyond Japan's borders, well outside. And I think so the ground is being laid for a up-to-date interpretation of the Japanese constitution.
And there was a recent bilateral agreement between Australia and Japan.
Yes, the AUKUS agreement, AUKUS. And the Japanese are now in it. So, and by the way, in the communique that came out of the 2+2 meeting, the U.S. not only, and the two sides, I should say, not just the U.S., everybody said this was a good thing. So, we're starting to get our act together, but it's been a little slow.
Great.
That's a nice way to put it.
One of the important elements we have in our military inventory are the carrier battle groups.
Yes.
Across the globe. One of which, I guess, the Harry Truman, has been positioned in the Ionian Sea, I guess, to be close to the situation in Ukraine and Russia. But how many active battle groups that are not under repair or maintenance do we have floating around?
Usually 5.
Okay.
I mean, on a good day, when they're not, because it's an awful lot of servicing that goes into these, especially the carriers, that's required to keep them functional. And these are huge platforms, have 5,000 people on them.
Right.
And I don't know, 100+ airplanes. So, jet fighters and helicopters and all this stuff, surveillance aircraft, COD aircraft. I mean, carrier on deck delivery aircraft, all this stuff. So it's a big operation. The carrier task force contains the carriers, all the ships that go with the carriers, from oilers, lowly oilers, all the way up to Aegis cruisers, and includes submarines, nuclear submarines. So it's a lot of ships.
How vulnerable are they in the context of a conflict with China?
This is, of course, a very hotly debated subject. The Chinese have, since 1996, when the Chinese got, were trying to set up a situation where they could knock off Taiwan. We brought in, and I know very well about it because I was one of those demanding Washington move. I was sitting in Taiwan at the time. We brought 2 carrier task forces in, and the Chinese backed down. And so they have made it their #1 objective to destroy US carriers. And they practice it. I mean, we've just seen satellite pictures of a mock carrier on rails in the desert where the Chinese are practicing shooting at it. And they have, some very missiles that they claim can hit US carriers. We have Aegis cruisers, which have been upgraded quite a lot in recent years with new radars and new missiles, SM-3 missiles and SM-6 missiles. And we think, I don't know, but that's what the Navy says, and I believe it, they think they can counter any Chinese attacks. Also very difficult to hit anything at sea from 500, 600, 800 miles away. It's very difficult. And I don't know that Chinese have ever proven they could do that. So probably we need to bring carriers within, let's say, 500 miles of the target to make them effective against the Chinese invasion. But it's not our only tool. I mean, let's face it, we have aircraft in Japan, including F-35s. We have aircraft in Okinawa, F-35s, F-18s, stuff like that. We have a lot of assets that we can bring to bear. It's not going to be just one thing. So the Chinese may have practiced against one thing, but they're going to get other things. Are they going to attack Japan? Or are they going to, because then the Japanese defense forces are free to do anything they want. Are they going to attack Okinawa, which they claim, by the way? And the Chinese say it's Chinese. I don't know, but I think that there's reason to believe we have the capability right now to defend our carrier task forces, not only to defend them, but to use them very effectively against such an attempt by China to take Taiwan or to attack the Japanese islands, Senkaku Islands, or to attack Japan itself. We're in pretty good shape. Right now, the Chinese are constantly improving their capabilities, but they have the DF-21 missile, DF-21D, which is the carrier killer, they call it that. And sometimes you can over-advertise something.
Does that make the island of Guam a strategic bastion for the United States?
Guam is very far away.
I know.
It's more than 1,000 miles, isn't it? So it's very far away. It's certainly a place where you can launch bombers. And it's a place we can service and support carriers. It has that capability, it has a port capability, it has a very good port capability, and it has a very good airfield. So it's valuable. I don't want to say it's not valuable, but I think strategically you have to be closer. And Japan is the right place to be.
Okay. The Biden White House announced a change in command of the Central Command recently.
Yes, they did. It's not been approved yet, but it's announced.
Right. And this all comes after the debacle with the rout in Afghanistan, the resurgence of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, stop problems in Syria, and I guess the thinning out of US forces in Iraq. And then you've got Iran in its regional campaign with its proxies, whether it's the Houthi in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Iraqi militias, and of course, the support of Hamas and the PIJ. So what's the geopolitical mission that this reduced Central Command can credibly perform?
Well, it has fewer and fewer feet on the ground or boots on the ground in the Middle East. I mean, no doubt about that. It also this guy's coming in at a very sensitive time. His name is Lieutenant General Michael Eric, the guerrilla. He's a real fighter. He's a serious warrior. In Iraq, he was wounded 3 times and kept on fighting. Pretty amazing fellow. Right now he's Lieutenant General, but he'll become 4-star.
I think he's what, 18th Airborne Corps Commander?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very good choice. By a common consensus, it's a very good choice. He's the right guy. The last commander of the CENTCOM was not the right guy. He proved that in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Made a mess. So this guy, first of all, it's like a new football coach, He's got this messed up team. The defense is bad. The offense is bad. The quarterback's no good. The general manager is a jerk. I mean, you have all these problems and you got to fix them or you're going to get fired. So he's got a terrible challenge on his hands, I think, to get this all right. Make it even worse, we've pulled out our air defense assets out of the Persian Gulf. I mean, why the hell did we do that? What kind of nonsense? This was part of the Biden baloney of pacifying the Iranians and making them flexible. It was an idiotic thing to do. It was reckless. And the last CENTCOM commander, after he screwed up Afghanistan, couldn't say anything because he had screwed up Afghanistan. So he was impotent. So our new CENTCOM commander, Kirill, is going to have a terrible challenge, a big challenge. He has to get it right. He has to reorganize things. Right now, the Saudis are out of Patriot missiles. I mean, those Houthis are shooting hundreds of these missiles at them all the time. And the Saudis can't fight back very much longer because there's no more missiles. What do you mean there's no more missiles? I mean, what is this nonsense? I mean, these are things that just have to be fixed. We can't let our troops be sitting in places as sitting ducks, which is what we've been doing for far too long.
Right.
We have to be proactive, and we can't let the Iranians get away with what they're getting away with in the Middle East. If you want a nuclear agreement with Iran, that's one thing. But when you're talking about taking over the Middle East, that's a totally different thing. And CENTCOM has to be in the Pentagon the key force to deal with that kind of crisis, that kind of problem. They haven't been. So I see him as a new coach with a bad team, with a broken team, and he's got to fix it. That's his job. He's the sort of fellow that ought to do that, but he's going to need topside political support. He's going to have to convince Milley, who made a mess in Afghanistan too and got away with it, and Austin, who made a mess in Afghanistan and got away with it, Blinken, who's an idiot because he doesn't understand the military part of this and he just lets it, makes concessions to the Iranians, which are reckless, and Biden, same story. So he's got a big topside problem. His general managers are not very good, and he has to teach them and get them to understand what they need to do, and without getting fired. Tough problem. Good luck.
I'd like to turn to Israel, which I gather has also been taken into the Central Command.
Yes, Israel has been moved from EUCOM, the European Command,
right,
to CENTCOM. That's some time ago now, some months ago. It was never in CENTCOM in the first place because the Arabs didn't like Israel. So
things have changed.
Things have changed with the agreements with the UAE and such, Morocco, others. So it has changed, yes. And now they want Israel very badly in there. So putting them in, from that point of view, putting them in CENTCOM was a good thing. Taking them out of EUCOM was not such a good thing because the Europeans need the Israelis for lots of reasons in terms of defense. Not that the Israelis are going to go to Europe and fight, they're not, of course not. But the Israelis are very advanced in terms of technology and capabilities and to help Europe deal with things like, let's take the drone threat that we talked about. There's a perfect example where Israel's well advanced over just about anybody. and dealing not only in dealing with it, but also making their own. So they're on both sides of the equation. So the Europeans, well, I think what the Israelis have figured out is that they can still continue their relationships with the NATO people while being in CENTCOM, and that's good. I think that's promising. Good stuff.
Earlier in this conversation, we mentioned the fact that Israel has a very sensitive relationship with the Russians, particularly dealing with matters in Iraq and Syria. And recently, they were attacking Iranian warehouses not very far away from the port of Tartus.
That's right.
In Syria.
Right.
And so one has to scratch one's head and another part of your anatomy and say, how durable is the deconfliction agreement in this case?
Well, it's still there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's still there and it's still functioning. There's a rough bump back in the summer with the Russians. And the Russians were sort of not happy. I'm not sure exactly why they weren't happy, but maybe they weren't happy. But that's calmed down. That seems to have gone away, at least for the moment. I think it's durable. Look, the Russians need the Israelis need the Russians. The Russians don't want Iran to run Syria because then you don't need the Russians anymore. Right? I mean, so they're not keen on the Iranians staying there, or for that matter, Hezbollah staying there. They want them to go away. You know, this is our place. You know, we spent a lot to keep Assad in power. We've helped deal with this, and we want to run this show, not Tehran and not Hezbollah. We want to do it ourselves. So they're not unhappy so much when the Israelis pop the Hezbollah guys or the Iranians.
Right. Okay. Given what happened in the last operation in May of this past year in 2021, Operation Guardian of the Walls, particularly when it reflected on handling the precision rocket and drone capabilities of Hamas, PIJ, and Hezbollah. How would Israel counter those threats in the case of a conflict with Iran?
Well, they're far less of a threat in the case of a conflict with Iran because they're far away.
Okay.
I don't see the Iranians capable of running drones all the way to Israel right now. I think they don't have that capability. Right. So they'd have to try to run them from proxies, from Syria or from Iraq or someplace, and those are going to get banged by the Israelis. So I don't think there's a drone threat of that sort, of a strategic kind. I think the real fight with the Iranians is going to be their nuclear and missile systems, and their missiles do pose a threat. They're long range, they're reasonably accurate. They can carry explosive, they can carry chemicals, they can carry biological weapons, they can also carry nuclear weapons, and they're working hard to get to nuclear weapons. So the real issue is whether the Israelis are going to tolerate a nuclear Iran.
Israelis also have their own nuclear-equipped ICBMs.
Yeah, but I mean, you don't want to do that.
That's correct.
So that brings you to this great question, which the Israelis are confronting, and I don't know that they know the answer themselves, which is, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, what do we do? Do we take them out?
That raises the question about something that's been promoted, the so-called Plan B, in case of the collapse of these discussions in Vienna between the US and the EU3 on revitalization, if you want to call it, of the JCPOA agreement. So the question is, how credible is Israel undertaking that mission alone?
I think it depends on whether Israel's assessment is that it's an existential threat that they can't live with. That simple. And that's not an easy assessment to make.
Correct.
But it doesn't just depend on the weapons, it depends on the politics. And, you know, I think as long as Iran is dominated by the Revolutionary Guards and this Al-Quds group that they have, the more dangerous things are. Because I don't think a civilian Iranian leader would be likely to take a risk of using such force, using such weapons. But when you get to the Al-Quds and to the Revolutionary Guards, you can't be that certain. So I imagine what the Israelis will do is sort of what the United States tried to do, which is to behead the Al-Quds.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, what they did with Soleimani, and which made a point. It's one of the things I think Trump was right about. And I think that the same kind of strategy, you know, you can't have just a strategy that says, well, we're going to go knock off their missiles or knock off their nuclear facilities, and that'll be the end of it. No, doesn't work that way. You have to deal with the political part and who's in charge and who's in charge of what. I mean, Israel can live with Iran with a civilian leadership, but it can't live with Iran with a dangerous military leadership, which is hell-bent on destruction.
So your strategy is one that a lot of us have thought would be more realistic. It's a question of cutting off the head of the snake.
Right. I don't know what the Israeli plans are. They have been reluctant over the, people have talked a lot about, including my friend Michael Ledeen, talked a lot about regime change and how important regime change is, but I don't think it's regime change that we're really talking about. I think it's more, you have to drill down to the troublemakers, right? And get rid of them. The regime will take care of itself. But it's these crazies who are, you know, are capable of, you know, right now they look like they're capable of almost anything. And that's dangerous because they're in charge of the missiles. Okay.
They're almost the equivalent of what, the Nazi SS during World War II.
That has a lot of that smell. Yeah.
A lot of elements is similar in that regard.
Yeah. And so if I was writing a strategy, I would see, how can I get to them? How can I deal with them? How can I make their life miserable? I think that's more efficient way of addressing the problem. And it might be more acceptable. I mean, there's a problem with the United States too. The United States doesn't want to attack Iran.
Right.
No administration, not just the Democrats right now, but no administration wanted to do that. Bush didn't want to do it. No one wanted to do it. Trump didn't want to do it. It's the same old story. And it wasn't that we would lose; it's just that what will we gain? You know.
Well, certainly sanctions against the leadership of the IRGC and the Quds Force has not proven anything.
No, those don't work. I mean, that's just so you look like you're doing something.
So what you're really talking about is covert warfare.
I didn't say covert. I didn't say overt. I didn't say what it would be because I don't know. I think that if you were concerned about the threat and you wanted to reduce the threat profile, that's where you go looking. How you do it is another whole different story. And I think, you know, I'm not a head of the Mossad or the head of the Israeli Defense Forces, or for that matter, the head of CENTCOM. You know, I don't know right now. I mean, that's where you sit down, you figure out what you can do, what you may be able to do with some additional, you know, assets, where you can compromise these people and put them out of business.
With that, Stephen, I want to thank you for another brilliant, and I mean this sincerely, brilliant canvassing of geopolitical and technology activities associated with a lot of threats around the globe.
Well, we live in uncertain times, no doubt about that.
Yes,
I don't know what's brilliant, but I'm at least, asking a lot of questions. But Jerry, thank you very much for having me. It was enjoyable.
very good. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Shoshana.
I will. Take care.